My name is Patrick Donnelly, and I'm on a mission to build better leaders. If I live to be 100, I doubt I'll ever talk with someone who has more power at his fingertips than today's guest, Air Force General Anthony Cotton. General Cotton is a 4-star general and one of only 11 combatant commanders in the United States. As Commander of U.S. Strategic Command, he's in charge of the entire U.S. military nuclear arsenal. Just keep that in perspective the next time you're feeling a bit overwhelmed by everything on your to-do list. I recommend that you listen for Cotton's 4 C's and the Cotton string theory of leadership. It's powerful stuff. Buckle up for 100% Cotton.
It's great to be here.
So, General, unlike industry, the Air Force doesn't hire its leaders from the outside, but grows them from within. Would you mind sharing with our listeners some of your background that led you to the point where you are now?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Patrick. So you're right. It was a great time being in the Space Coast when then Colonel Donnelly was my mission support group commander when I was a commander of 45th Space Wing. So it's great seeing you again and seeing what you're doing to prepare the next generation to take my place and to take others that are in similar positions, see what the future has in mind. And I think we're in a really good spot when it comes to that. So when it comes to my background, I think, one, I am a son of an Air Force Chief Master Sergeant. The big joke is I'm the only child of a diamond-wearing Chief Master Sergeant, so everyone always kind of goes, ooh, having an old school chief as a dad. So I went through a pretty disciplined life growing up. My dad was all about good order and discipline, if you will. But at the same time, he was allowed me to kind of sprout wings and do things that interested me. Because I came out of the womb as a member of the United States Air Force, I always wanted to follow in my father's footsteps, but I wanted to take the officer path and had full support from there. And I think it's, when we talk about what brings you to the position of where you're at, regardless if you're a 4-star general or whether if you're a flight commander, a squadron commander, or a wing commander. It's a pretty simple concept, but I think it's hard for people to understand. And it really starts from the time, and I'll just talk about officership, but it's actually for the enlisted force itself. Do the best in the job that you're in. It really, truly is that simple. Do the best in the job that you're in. I started off as an ICBM missile crew member. I spent about half of my career in the ICBM business, half of my career in the space business. But it was that simple where I wanted to be the best second lieutenant, deputy combat crew member that I could be. I wanted to excel and be able to be either an instructor or a stand-of-val person because that was a hierarchy that was seen in the career field. I wanted to upgrade and be the best line crew member that I could be. And then I wanted to be the best stand-of-val or instructor that I could be. And I was a stand-of-val guy as a crew commander as well. And so it's really, how do you get your reps and sets? You remember I used to talk about this thing that I coined when I was the wing commander at Malmstrom Air Force Base. And it was called Cotton's 4 C's. And I think it's actually incredibly relevant to that journey that I'm talking about in regards to how do you become the best you can be in the job that you're in, right? So the first one is you need to be competent. So that means you need to get into the books and you need to understand, regardless of what your AFSC is, how to be the best that you can be in the current job that you're in and understand what is required and asked of you in that job. The second piece of that is commitment. How committed are you in that task to be able to do that? The third, which I think is really interesting, is composure. And the reason I said composure when I was a wing commander is, hey, when the balloon goes up and things get pretty hectic, you need to understand that you should be able to hold your hand out and have a steady hand. And especially if you become more of a senior leader. But at the wing level, that's a squadron commander. Right? So if the men and women see you panic as a squadron commander, they're going to probably start panicking. And, and God knows what happens if they start seeing that at the higher levels, right? So, how do you maintain that composure?
Can I interrupt for 1 second
Please.
on composure? Is it that you are able to master your emotions to the degree that you're not feeling that inside, or that you have mastered your ability to, regardless of what you're feeling on the inside, to maintain a calm demeanor on the outside?
Yeah, I think it's more of the latter, Patrick, because there are some things that are probably, there's some things that I say that would freak anyone out, right? And it doesn't, it's not that I'm not susceptible to getting freaked out over some things that might happen, but I do understand that if I convey that emotion to the men and women that are under my charge, then a couple of things can happen. One, they're like, well, holy cow, if Colonel Cotton, Major Cotton is freaking out over this. And it all depends on the level of the problem, right? If it's really kind of a lower level problem that people shouldn't be freaking out over anyway, the men and women in charge can go, well, what happens if it's something that's really serious? And then the other one, the inverse of that is, it is something really serious, but man, I'd follow he or she anywhere, because look how calm and how level-headed they are, and still making the decisions that need to be made to press us forward. So that's what I mean by composure.
So how did you get that? I mean, like you said, we all feel the emotion sometimes, and sometimes we're confronted with situations we don't know exactly what to do. What did you do to develop that sense of taking a step back and lowering your outward demeanor so that you're conveying what it is that you want to convey?
Yeah, it kind of goes back, Patrick, to what I was telling you about in regards to doing the best job you can do in the job that you're in, and then opportunities will afford themselves. So in my case, it wasn't that Tony Cotton was some special guy that has some special talents that just kind of, I'm an absorber. So what I was able to do is, for example, when I was that, lieutenant captain at my first wing level assignment, I was blessed to have an opportunity to be a wing executive officer. To be frank, I watched the wing commander and saw how he attacked problems and took notes, right? And mental notes, physical notes, and took notes to add in my Rolodex, if you will, on, okay, man, that was a pretty cool thing. I'm going to keep that and use that if I have an opportunity to do that later. Just as well as some of the things that I may have seen, folks that I work for kind of go, man, I would never do that if I was in an opportunity to have that. So you learn good and bad things, right? You learn things that, yeah, I think I would have done that a little different. And what's neat is you might get, because of the certain jobs you have, being a senior military assistant, being an executive officer, you actually get pretty good insight. So you really do understand why your principal made the decision that he or she may have made. You may or not agree with how the decision they made. What's cool, if you have a boss that then you can actually ask he or she, well, I don't understand why you came up with that decision. Do you mind kind of walking me through that? I was blessed to have bosses that had no problem being able to do that. I've tried to do that with the folks that work for me in my front offices too, is, hey, if you don't understand why we made that decision, let me talk you through that a little bit. And I think that's really, really important. So learning from others, being that sponge to kind of figure out, one, what do you want to be like when you grow up? What do you not want to be like when you grow up? You get to see from the environment that's around you.
So it sounds like for you, it was a very intentional process of, I am going to be watching at every opportunity for what lessons can I learn from the people who are around me, whether it's senior to me or subordinate to me. What can I see? And then how do I find a way to fuse that into the way I am dealing with situations that might arise? So,
absolutely correct. And then finally, on the 4 C's, we talked about 3 of them. And I think the one that's just as important is compassion, having compassion and understanding compassion. To be frank, not to get it twisted with not holding people accountable. So you have to sometimes do a little explaining to folks when I mention 4 C's and I say being a compassionate, empathetic, leader. That by no means says that I don't hold people accountable. I think the credibility that you have as a leader is folks understanding that you do hold people to standards And if they don't meet those standards, you hold them accountable. But at the same time, you still can be compassionate and empathetic.
Right.
So
you mentioned compassion, and I really like the way you distinguish that, because we've gone around and trained about 1,700 different students in our leadership workshops. And one of the things that I'm noticing, base after base and industry after industry, is that supervisors of all levels, but particularly younger supervisors, they really struggle with that aspect of, I want to be compassionate. And for them, that means that there can never be accountability that needs to flow, that there are never consequences that come from bad action. And I think you're right. There is a way to both be compassionate and to hold standards, because ultimately, by holding people to standards, you're showing that you care for them. You're showing that you care for them and their future. You're also showing that you care for the job that you're doing. And that's important enough that we've got to keep people moving in that positive direction.
yeah, I mean, I think that's a standard bearer of the department, right? Of being, whether you're an airman, soldier, sailor, or guardian, or Marine, it doesn't matter. That's fundamental to what makes us an incredible joint force. So I think it kind of goes back to just good order and discipline. You bring up a point, and one of the things that's kind of interesting is when we have these conversations in regard of, how do you hold people account? And one of the things that I thought was kind of interesting, and I hope we see a flip of the script, because it's been in my past couple assignments, it's been pretty interesting, and I'll give you a couple of examples. At least Tony Cotton as a commander, when I have a subordinate commander that has an issue, my expectation is that subordinate commander kind of ran through the traps to try to close on that issue as much as he or she could, and then would report to me on the fact that I've tried this, I've tried that, I've tried all of these things, and sir, I'm still short. I need your help.
Yes, sir.
At least that's how I was raised, and that's how I did things as a squadron commander or a wing commander or a group commander or even a nav commander, if you will. What I started to see a little bit is kind of a transition to where folks thought their job was to identify problems,
Right.
and then foist it to the higher ups. Because there'd be a couple of times where they talk about a problem. Well, sir, here's a problem that I've discovered, and I'm like, that's great. So what have you done so far to identify the problem? And I'm handing it over to you. That's not the expectation, and I don't think any commander would see that as an expectation from a subordinate commander to foist the problem over to the senior principal to work. That's one that I always tried to articulate, especially, as a MAGCOM commander, even here as a combatant command, telling folks within my staff to, hey, work through the problems. I have no problem being the world's highest rank action officer if I need to be, but, make sure you go through the wickets to be able to try to solve the problem at the lowest levels if you can, and not just identify a problem.
Right.
You're not a problem solver just because you identify problems. Right. Anybody can identify problems. People just, Joe Blow walking the streets can identify some of the problems that we might have, even here at Stratcom, just by passing in the night. It's really about how do you try to solve the problems that you're facing. And then once you hit that wall, then moving to the next level, but at the lowest level. And I'm talking about commands. A lot of that can be done. Let's talk about our enlisted force. A lot of the stuff can be done at the mid-level NCO level, right?
Right.
And we have got to get back into reps and sets and being able to understand how to do that.
I agree. I remember from my experience, there were times when younger leaders would bring to me issues, and they were the obvious questions that anybody would ask. And when I would ask the question, it was clear they didn't have the answers. And so, like you, one of my retorts was always, don't make me ask the obvious question. That's your job. And when there's a problem that you can solve, that's your responsibility to solve it.
I had an opportunity to work with a senior leader who coined this phrase, don't make me ask the perfect question. So I use that quite a bit during my time as a general officer, because I was working for this senior leader as a colonel, but it was perfect because it's so true, right? that you'll get an IPR, a program review or something like that, and you'll sit and you'll listen, and then you'll say, well, what about this? And how about this? What about this? And then yes, sir, everything is, yeah, we're going to have a problem with that though. Okay, so if I wouldn't have asked that question, would we have come to that conclusion?
Right.
So you have to go through your reps and sets to kind of understand how do you prepare yourself to be able to adequately brief a decision maker, regardless of the level, but a decision maker to actually make the right decisions, right?
Right.
I think, you talked about me being one of 11. So the best military advice is what you hear is the coin of the realm for us as combatant commanders to the Secretary of Defense or to the President of the United States. My job is to afford the President as much decision space as he can have. That is my job as a commander of STRATCOM, regardless of whatever the task at hand is. If all of a sudden I'm giving military advice to the Secretary of Defense and or the chairman or the president, but I failed to even kind of figure out if I've asked a perfect question to afford the decision space, what does that do? I put it in simple terms for folks. What we thought we would have been able to give the president hours of decision space now turns into maybe half of that time, because now he asked the question that I didn't have an answer to, which I probably could have. Now I got to go back and try to solve that, get the answer to that, and then come back and say, okay, let's try this again. Sorry about that, Mr. President. What are your decisions now? Well, whether I took 2 minutes away from him or took an hour away from him, I took decision space away from the POTUS. And that's how people should think about things when, afforded the opportunity. Now, as a combatant command, it's at the highest levels. But even if it's a flight commander that's got to report up to a squadron commander or others, I think it still applies, because decision space is what you want to be able to give a decision maker adequate time to make the right decision and not have to come back and kind of go, okay, let me modify that.
Right.
So it's incumbent on the folks that are preparing and providing information to understand that.
Is there a way that you can, for those that are trying to cultivate that in their younger leaders, how does a leader do that? What type of interactions need to be had with younger leaders to grow them into a place where they feel comfortable and understand that degree of their responsibility in providing that best advice?
Yeah, I think it comes with time. It does. I mean, the experience does matter, right? In this case, I think it's a great opportunity. Little things like at the squadron commander level, I think little things like special projects that a squadron commander might have, and finding that young staff sergeant or that young captain and giving them a project to work. It could be something, nothing's mundane when you're doing a leadership lab, because I think it's all leadership lab. But it might be something for, like at a squadron level, is we would see as a squadron, I think, holiday parties and all that kind of stuff. It sounds mundane, but everyone knows that there's a lot that goes into something like that, especially if your squadron is pretty large. But seeing how people are detail-oriented, how they can delegate when they come up with their, building out their committees, all of that is a leadership lab, right before your eyes. And the interaction between the ops officer and or squadron commander to those members of that committee, as an example, I think is that leadership lab tool, Patrick, that you can use to kind of call out and do the training, if you will, at that point, to kind of go, hey, that was great, but what you might want to do next time is boom, 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 right? Just the interjection of thought during the reviews that might happen with the OPSO or with the squadron commander is actually pretty relevant to the young members that are doing it. I got a great example here at STRATCOM. Was a couple of years ago, our birthday ball for STRATCOM. I had a young Army captain. She was the Projo, and I was so impressed with how detailed she was. You could just see that she was, she had her stuff in a sock, and you could see the maturity level. You could see the attention to detail. You can see all those things just because she was the Projo. And oh, by the way, we've had lieutenant colonel project officers for that same type of ball with 1,000 people showing up. But we had this, major select who was doing it. And she did so well, Patrick, that she ended up being my aide de camp.
Is that right?
And she's moved on now. She's in the Washington, D.C. area. But like I said, to me, everything is a leadership lab. Everything, so every time I sit, and I think my staff would agree, every time I sit and take a meeting, every time, I almost have a after action after every meeting with my staff on, okay, so, what did you see in that? And what could have been done better? Not from their perspective, but on how, folks presented things, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And as you remember, I did that even as a wing commander at staff meetings.
I do remember.
So I think that's kind of the thing that I developed over the years that others can do as well.
So once again, it comes back to being intentional. You talked about the reps and sets and using every opportunity at your disposal to continue growing those people. That whether it's a holiday party or some special project, using that as an opportunity intentionally to grow those qualities in those younger leaders so that they carry that through the rest of their careers.
Yeah, and I think it's just as important to let them know that. Let them know that, you're not bashing or praising for no reason. It's about a teaching moment for the things that they're doing.
That's good. Intentionality is one of the issues that we hit on very often. I think oftentimes leaders, because they're busy or whatever excuse you want to give, I just begin to assume that I'm doing things. I look at results and assume that the inputs that went in were fine, instead of taking the time to really be intentional about how am I developing? How am I giving feedback? Am I being clear? Do they really understand what I'm saying, or am I just assuming they understand what I mean?
Yeah. I think at the senior levels, it's really, really important to have a staff around you that's willing to let the boss know if they're not wearing any clothes, right? And when the emperor's not wearing clothes. So, I've had opportunity to be in a front office staff for more times than I want to remember. But one of the things that I thought was pretty neat was, one, you have to have a principal that will allow you to do that. And my guys, because of what I've learned with one of my bosses, a couple of my bosses, I've been pretty blessed on being in front offices with some really incredible senior leaders that, use that model that I just described over the past couple of minutes and use that. And that's where I got that from, because that's the model they used. But it's really neat to be able to kind of go, well, how did that go? And then get a different point of view, right? And then I was afforded that with a senior leader, and the senior leader would say, well, how did that go? And I'm like, that didn't go too well. And I said, I knew the intent, what you wanted, because we talked about it before you even had the meeting. We've had the meeting. We've let everybody go. They've already come to my office and says, okay, we didn't know what the hell the boss was talking about. My job then is like, oh, okay. So then I run back in the office and I said, hey, you remember when I said that I didn't think that went too well? That didn't go too well because I've been spending the last 15 minutes just kind of getting people to understand what you were trying to say. And then he says, well, I appreciate that. Let's bring everybody back in, which is interesting for me because as the SMA, I'm taking advantage of that, because then that would have been 30 minutes out of my life trying to explain to each individual.
Right.
So the senior leader was able to bring them back and do certain things and say, okay, I heard you guys didn't understand. And what that did was that brought trust to the staff to kind of go, okay, well, Cotton didn't throw us under the bus.
Right.
He went in and told the boss that, hey, we don't know what he's talking about. So, and then he kind of went through it again, and everybody, oh, okay, I think we got it now. I tried to do, and I learned from that too. Like I said, I try to be a sponge when it comes to leadership lessons. So I try to do that too. And hopefully other people, learn that from me, that I think that is a great notion and a great method of being able to kind of figure out, okay, where are everybody around? So, my exec, for example, we talk often, and I even when I'll send an email or something, and I always, I think I used to tell you guys this, the worst thing you can do on email is try to react to something because you're upset. And I call it the caps lock moment.
Right.
And you never want to do a caps lock moment because you can't retrieve that so you just kind of take a step back, look at it, and kind of go, okay. A lot of times I don't even use an email. I'll say, hey, just yeah, let's talk to this person on the phone and let's figure out where we are. But if we do, I would look over the shoulder when I used to be, working for a principal and kind of go, I don't know if I would say that, sir. And I get my guys to do the exact same thing. So I think it's really important to.
But that does take, as you say, you have to have a principle that allows that. And it sounds like you are very deliberate about showing your humility and your desire that, hey, ultimately, I want the best possible answer. And that means if I can do something better or more effectively, I'm all about that. Share it with me. And I think that's a great quality to have as a leader, because you're now inviting people in and giving the confidence that they can share their honest thoughts and giving you real feedback as opposed to just rubber stamping whatever they think you want to hear.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's helpful for the organization at the end of the day if you don't allow that bit of humility, because that humility plays out not just for the senior principal, it plays out for the organization itself, right? I love Hamilton. So I tell everybody, I said, one of the things you always want to be able to do when it comes to your organization is you want to have a seat at the table. Mm-hmm. Or as in Hamilton would say, in the musical Hamilton, you got to be in a room where it happens, right? And if you're not in a room where it happens, you miss out on some pretty important discussions. So being invited to be a participant, and air quotes here, room where it happens, is for the betterment of the organization, right? So that's why I think sometimes you got to kind of keep some of that emotion in check. So play it out when you need to.
So if you're invited into the room, you should feel, I'm invited here for a reason. I need to be, they're asking for my input. I need to give my honest input, my best advice.
Absolutely right.
And then it's up to the decision maker to make the decision.
That's right. That's right. At the end of the day, I'm afforded the opportunity to provide as much information and data that I can for a decision maker to make a decision, right? Whether or not that decision maker make the decision of which I input it. I don't take that personal if they don't, as long as I did everything I needed to do to present the facts for them to, one, understand what risk they might be accepting if they don't, and then understanding that they're willing to accept that risk. And then guess what? We salute smartly and move out.
I'm just curious, have you ever been in a situation where you're in a meeting, you're at the table, and by far the majority of the people are leaning a certain way, but you feel like there's something that kind of goes against that tide of momentum, and you offer that out despite the fact that it seems that you're the naysayer?
Yeah, but now it's probably not necessarily here as a combatant commander, but probably when I was a MAGCOM commander. But there's ways to deal with that too, right? So I love being able to collaborate with my peers, right? So I really want to kind of understand where everyone's head's at before we have a meeting in front of the senior. And then I'll know, what the vote looks like, if you will.
Okay.
Before we have the vote. And there's, so I think, I call it the back room, being able to understand how to get my point across in the back room, if you will. And then convince others that, okay, well, we didn't, I call it, I don't like sausage making in front of the boss.
Right.
Yeah, if you remember, when I first came to Patrick, that was kind of how they did staff meetings, was the staff meetings went incredibly long. And I was, and you remember the vice wing commander, I was his ops group commander.
Right.
Prior. So he told you guys, well, General Cotton's not going to be that kind of guy. So there was times where, we would go to the staff meeting and there's sausage making that's going on. And you remember I'd push back from the table and I'd get up and leave. Right. And I said, hey, when you guys have the COAs, let me know. But I'm not sitting here listening to a whole bunch of colonels figure out what they want the COAs to be that they're going to present to me. Right?
This should have happened in the back room.
That should have happened in the back room.
Right.
And I think using that method, it actually worked, right? Because then everyone kind of goes, oh, yeah, I guess we probably could have had this meeting be a 15-minute meeting instead of an hour meeting, because at the end of the day, the principal gets to do what we just talked about, even as a wing commander. You guys present 2 or 3 COAs. I accept one of those, or I modify one of those, and then we press on, right? But I would never kind of negate any of them. Right, I would accept one of the 3, and then if I needed to make a change to it, I would say, okay, that's great. COA 2, but here's what we're going to do. And this is the modification that we're going to do with that. But thanks for guys for presenting the 3 COAs and do that, as opposed to spending an hour to kind of come up with COA 2 with a modification.
Right. The leader doesn't necessarily to be involved in that whole process. Give me what you've got. I'll make a decision, and then we'll move forward.
It's about delegating the pieces of that puzzle, of which the group commanders should all take their slices, come up with what they want, and then present that up. And then at the end of the day, the decision maker. And what does that do? Kind of goes back to what I was telling you about. It gave me as a wing commander more decision space, because I didn't just waste, well, it wasn't an hour, because I think the first couple of weeks I was there, almost every meeting was an hour long.
Right.
And then we changed that, because I barely have hour meetings here. I just am not a fan of long drawn out meetings, but being able to kind of be pretty concise on what the ask is. What do you want me to do? What's the ask? And then, okay, that sounds good. Let's press and move forward.
Yeah. I don't know anybody that doesn't like having a little bit of extra time to do other things that are pressing. Hey, I wanted to switch gears just a little bit, if you don't mind. You taught me a lot of things at Patrick Air Force Base, but one of the things that was most impactful for me was when you shared an example, you shared an analogy of leadership that has stuck with me ever since. And almost everywhere I go, I share some version of this, and I now call it the cotton string theory of leadership. And often people are like, cotton string, what's that? And I'm like, no, it's general cotton string theory of leadership. Would you mind sharing that for the audience?
Sure. So it's basically the principle of tension on a string. And if you recall, when I arrived at Patrick, we were literally in the window for an inspection. The first UEI for Air Force Space Command, actually. Mm-hmm. And I had just left. I literally changed command out of Malmstrom, drove straight to Patrick, and took the flag for Patrick. And then we were in the window for another inspection. I just left the NSI at Malmstrom, if you recall. So one of the things was we had a meeting, and we were just talking about, okay, so where are we as a wing in preparation for this major inspection?
Right.
And the team's like, well, sir, we're kind of we're just getting started. I'm like, you're actually in the window right now. What do you mean you're just getting started? And then that's when I kind of I told you guys about my theory in regards to tension on the string. I said, well, what always works better for me in my methodology on preparation is you can't just wait 24 hours before a marathon, decide you're going to do stretches, and then you're going to be able to run 26 miles. You have to kind of work up to that, because what ends up happening, and it literally can happen to muscles, is you can just snap something, right? So if you don't have a constant pressure, and not really tight pressure, but constant pressure on your organization, on its mission, and always kind of, as a missileer just leaving a missile wing, it's one of those where, we had no notices at any given time. And that was something that Space Command, wasn't doing. But my wing should be prepared at any given time to have someone fly in, parachute in, and kind of go, okay, I want to understand, you guys execute this, this, and this. Well, it's going to be kind of tough to do that if there's a slack in the string.
Right.
And then all of a sudden you get to tighten up on that string. When you do that, 2 things can happen. One, and more likely what will happen is that string will break, right? And then using this analogy, the wing, it won't be prepared because it wasn't adequately prepared the whole time. If in fact there was a little tension on that string before, guess what? You can put more foot-pounds of pressure on that string and really garner more effect out of your men and women under your charge, and you'll be pretty successful. But it has to be pretty constant. So I'm not a big fan of, okay, let's do some last-minute ramp-up. I like to have folks steady, understand what they're doing. And that's kind of the concept that I introduced to you when you were my support group commander.
I think it's great. I can picture that, and I can picture if a string has a lag in it, it's by nature, anything that's moving across that string is going to be less efficient. There's a sag, and then the jerk often creates a snap. And it's also very difficult in the heat of the moment to figure out where to stop pulling because it's crisis point now.
Absolutely right.
So just being able to keep, like you said, there's times that you need to ratchet the tension up a little bit, but if it's already tense, if it's already taut, then you can actually do that much more effectively in a controlled manner.
Yeah, what's interesting is, the triad of which I'm in command now, that's just by nature the business of my components in STRATCOM. By nature, right? We're always ready, right? So all three legs of the triad always has a little bit of tension on the string all the time. So we can generate forces at a moment's notice if we need to.
Yeah. How do you do that? So the principle makes perfect sense to me, but if I'm a young leader growing up and I'm trying to decide what is the tension on the string right now, are there ways that you would advise people to, how do you evaluate that? How do you know kind of where you are as an organization?
Yeah, I mean, it's different for different organizations though, right? I think for, let's just go back and, we spent a lot of time talking about our Patrick days, but I think it's relevant. Just think about what your responsibilities was as my support group commander, in charge of, multiple facilities. The main base at Patrick, though, the operation never took place at Patrick. It was always at the Cape.
Yes, sir.
Right. So, so what are the things that prepared us from your vantage point is probably a little different than what prepared Doug Shess, who was my ops group commander at the time, for operations at the Cape. I think being able to, one, get folks that was 23 miles away at Patrick Air Force Base, the majority of your forces, to understand that what they do was relevant to the mission at the Cape was the starting point, right? So that was my charge to you, and making sure that the med group commander, that she understood what happened or didn't happen in the med group affected the operations at the Cape. And then the launch group who was at the Cape understood his role. So foundationally, if you remember, something as little as part of onboarding, if you recall, I told the folks that spent the predominance of their time at Patrick Air Force Base that part of onboarding was they had to spend a day up to see what the mission looked like at the Cape, right? And regardless if you're in personnel, if you're the force support squadron commander, it didn't matter. You need to understand the med group commander. We didn't require you guys to come for launch operations. Well, you actually had a role in launch operations, but some of the folks didn't come for launches, and we said, no, we're going to mandate that, you're going to sit through the launch count to kind of see those kind of things. So I think they have stake in the mission, right? And I think that's important. That makes it easier for them to understand why they have to maintain a proficiency, if you will. And I think that worked for us in that regard. But like I said, it's a little different for a force support officer than it would be for, a launch control, a launch officer in the range squadron or in the launch group, et cetera, using Patrick as an example.
Right. I do remember, and you probably would remember this, shortly after I arrived there, one of my squadron commanders also arrived. And so we got there within about a week of each other, and you called us both in, and you gave us very explicit expectations about an area of the command that needed work. And one of the things I really appreciated about you is that you didn't try to sugar up the words. You just said like it is. This is a problem. This is my expectation, and this is what I want to see fixed. And I remember absorbing that and looking at the squadron commander who had just gotten through the door, and we walked out into the hallway, and he was just like, oh my gosh, I haven't been here 2 days yet, and I've got this massive expectation. And I said, look, this is a good thing. You know exactly what he needs to see, the expectation that he has. All you have to do is figure out how to start showing them that you're moving in that direction tomorrow.
Yeah, I try to, there's a good and bad in that, right? Because, there's a lot of things, and this is a cautionary tale that I would tell all commanders, though, is there are a lot of things that you probably can handle on your own, but you shouldn't, because it's never going to be a teaching moment if you do. You'll never be able to have your subordinate grow if you just kind of say, well, you know what, forget it. I'll just do it myself. So that was kind of what that was. And I do remember that quite often. Actually, my staff is laughing because I think I've told that story. But I think being able to do a couple of things, and in one, if you recall, we still had some issues. And I remember the exit brief for that squadron commander was really interesting because the exit brief for that squadron commander was, sir, I just didn't get it. It took me months to really kind of understand why you were throttling me so hard, but now I get it, right? Mm. And I said, well, it would have been better if you would have figured that out, 8 months ago. But I'm glad you understand now. But I think, if nothing else, I think folks, I'm candid, right? And there's something to be said about having some candor, especially, when you want to be pretty succinct, so you don't have to kind of go back and kind of go, well, I don't understand why you didn't understand this.
Right.
So there are things that you need to be pretty deliberate in your direction. Then there's other things that you actually can be pretty generalized. The thing that one of the good and bad lessons that we're talking about in sitting in a background of being an executive officer or a senior military assistant is you get to see so many of the decision makers, senior leaders that you work for, and you can kind of go, okay, I don't think that was directive enough. So I think they're going to not be satisfied with the product, right? And then you just kind of weigh that out to see if that's going to happen, right? Yeah. And the next thing you know, they come back and kind of go, well, that's not what I wanted. And you kind of, okay, there it was, right? So there are things for me that I'm okay that you guys didn't quite get that. I'll be general to a point, but there are some things where we don't have time to, relitigate this, have me come back to me. And then it's like 180 off of what I want because I was too general. Right. It was a generalized comment, right? And the generalization was too much because that then takes up time. And there are some things that we just don't. So I'll be pretty succinct on certain things, but then on other things where it's like, time's not a factor. Sure, let's turn this into, because everything is a leadership lab moment. But in this case, it can be a leadership lab moment, and no harm, no foul.
Well, I'll be honest with you. I felt like you handled that appropriately because you didn't tell the person what to do. You didn't tell them how to solve the problem. You just laid out very clear expectations and gave him an expectation also of the time that he needed to get that fixed. And that focused his mind. There was no doubt this needs to be a priority for me. Yep. And so in that particular instance, he was able to jump right on top of it. Yep. He made a dramatic change very quickly. And that piece of the mission was kind of handled for the rest of the time that you were there.
Successful. Yes.
So I actually really appreciated that. And I think at the end, while he felt a moment of panic when he first got there was a sense of relief that when he needs something from me, there's not going to be a secret. He's going to be candid with me. I'm going to know exactly what he wants. And if I know what he wants, I can deliver it. So I thought that was great. We're getting a little close on time here. So I just like to shift thinking once again to, as we think about leadership, we often talk about that you need to be a good leader and that good leadership is critical, but we don't always have a chain of command that's necessarily gifted or has ever done leader development before. And so there's this kind of gray area. It's kind of vague. What does that mean? What does being a good leader mean? And for those people who don't have maybe a mentor or a supervisor that they can watch and learn from, are there particular resources that you recommend for how someone might be able to self-develop more effectively?
Yeah, I mean, your environment, maybe not necessarily your direct boss, but your environment, just use the term leadership lab throughout this whole podcast, but look around and your environment is just a petri dish of good and bad things to kind of reference, right? Don't, and I say this quite often, I just left, I did some ROTC visits here not too long ago, and I told the cadets, I said, hey, so when you become a second lieutenant in the United States Air Force or a guardian in the United States Air Force or Space Force, understand this, that you better kind of spot within the squadron, who is that tech sergeant or master sergeant that can help you, because you are the least, unless there's somebody that just came from BMT, you're going to be the most least experienced person in there, regardless of your rank and regardless of the fact that even the squadron superintendent has to salute you. I said, if you walk into that squadron being an overly cocky butterball second lieutenant, life is not going to be good for you, and it'll come back to haunt you. So just, look around, figure out who's the one that can offer you advice. And once again, it could be a staff sergeant, it could be a tech sergeant, master or senior. It could be a captain or a major. It could be a first lieutenant that just been around the block a couple of times.
Maybe even a civilian
employee as well. Even though when I was thinking about operational units, not a lot of civilians in my background. But take advantage of all of that, especially if you don't see that coming from, leadership teams. I have seen some squadrons where, unfortunately, we may not have, made the right choice on, who's leading those teams. I think we do an incredible job the majority of the time, but every once in a while, something slips through the cracks. But if that's the case, then, look around and find others. OPSOs, are usually kind of a good place to go as well. But that would be my recommendation for folks. And then obviously I got a couple of books I think that are kind of cool, that out of the ordinary type reading materials that I think are kind of describe what I've been talking about. The first one is a pretty simple one. It's Charles Province. It's Patton's 1-Minute Messages. A thin book, which is good because I'm an NC State grad. And it just really kind of talks about the notions, because if you talk about candor and being succinct, General Patton was that guy, right? So this is a pretty interesting read. I actually got this. This is a book called Chasing Excellence from Ben Bergeron. It actually talks about athletes, but I actually got this from a Blue Horizons student when I was at Air University. And it was based on the fact that, she recalled my 4 C's. And she said, hey, sir, here's a book that really kind of captures your 4 C's and how it works on world-class athletes and the same type of things and the same type of notions. So I thought that was a kind of neat book. The other one is called You're It. This is kind of a business management type book, but the title says it all: crisis, change, and how to lead when it matters most. I think we're kind of in the middle of that now, just because of transition of administrations.
Right.
Every 4 years it happens. I think that you can get a good sense of where you are in the pecking order and what you can do to affect change. How can you meet the intent of the administration and leadership team? And it's a pretty neat read. And then I think a lot of folks are familiar with Good to Great, Jim Collins' book.
It's a great book.
And those are the ones that I think from 06 and below level of command, I think you would nurture all this at the lower levels. And then by the time, if you have the opportunities to be a FO or GO, it's already in your head, and you can just have a refresher and pull out. As you can see, I have some tabs on a couple of these where it's like, okay, I remember seeing this in paragraph, whatever, chapter, whatever. Let me kind of refresh myself and see where we're on that.
That's great. Thank you for that advice and those recommendations. As I think about our conversation, whether it's talking about the 4 C's or the leadership lab or the self-development, so much of what you've said to me communicates the need for the individual to own, to some degree, their own development. There are things that each person can control and should control. And I think sometimes the temptation is, I'm going to blame my circumstances. I'm going to be frustrated over the fact that my particular supervisor wasn't as good as they should have been. At the end of the day, would you agree that it comes down to what are you doing for your own growth, your own development, your own pursuit of excellence?
Oh, absolutely, Patrick. I think if you think the big machine, is going to sit there and take care of Lieutenant Patrick Donnelly or Lieutenant Tony Cotton and carve the path for you without you having some input in your own destiny, think about it. That's what we're really talking about, right?
Right.
It's your own journey And if you think that you can maneuver through your journey without having any input on the rudder at all, that it's just, I'm on autopilot, that I'm in self-drive mode. Okay, maybe the folks in today's generation think that's a thing. But if you think that's going to make you successful, I think you're woefully mistaken.
I think those are great words to end on. General Cotton, thank you so much for joining us. It's been fun, it's been valuable, and I'm very grateful. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Patrick. It was great seeing you again.
Thank you for listening to Building Better Leaders. If you'd like to learn more about the Doolittle Leadership Center or the leader development workshops we deliver all around the world, please visit us at www.afa.org/DLC. Helping you become a better leader is our passion and our purpose.